That covers the civil unrest and the storms, Nines thought. Then she remembered one more thing as she listened to her NOAA radio. I have a CB, no, a ham radio that the guys at the range gave me. I just never learned how to use it. They'd given her some frequencies to write down and keep in her wallet for use in emergency, and she had forgotten all about it. She quickly took notes before she forgot again to get some ham literature she remembered seeing. There was a book from the ARRL out in the magazine area. She couldn't remember what it stood for, only that it was a reliable source for amateur radio. Nines also knew she had a few less technical books of how radios actually worked and etiquette, so she wouldn't sound dumb if she talked on the radio. She didn't have a code word or anything, but she was sure she recalled in emergencies that it was okay to talk on the ham if literally nothing else was working. Nines checked her phone, 0 bars. She lifted the landline phone up in no dial tone. Nines unplugged the bulky landline phone, put it in her desk, and shut the drawer. More room for my books, she said defiantly, and shoved all of the unimportant now junk off her desk. She read for a few hours before hearing some faint smashing. She ignored it at first, trying to convince her mind it was only the wind. After a few minutes and some muffled noises, she caved into the part of herself that knew the noise was more than nothing. She flicked her camera silently on, which started charging the ham and her cell. There was an all-in-one store across the street, and people had started breaking in and taking TVs and shoes and chips and 2-liter sodas. She dialed 911 last time in vain, and it gave a pre-recorded message about, "We're experiencing unusually high call volumes. If it's a violent crime, please leave a message." Then the connection went dead. She set her phone down in half disbelief, half indifference. The books and magazines she'd been reading throughout the morning all referenced this within the first few paragraphs. They'd all been from different authors, all specializing in everything from history to disaster preparedness, and now she was looking at it. Nobody seemed to be getting hurt, and one after another they slowly emptied the market chain of all its goods from order of their bizarre priorities. Nobody came to stop them. The surreal played in the black background on closed-circuit cameras as Nines thumbed through her literature. There were several common themes, one of which was that most people who were able to identify the disaster events ahead of time didn't even bother to go out during the initial hours. They would either bug out, which meant get to their safe refuge, or they would bug in, which meant hunker down and prepare for the long haul as early as possible. With a stack of books and magazines, Nine powered off the cameras and started reading, absorbing everything she could. She had enough firepower and training to stop a small gang and supplies to last weeks. She hoped nobody would come and try to take her books. Chapter 6. Lots to do. Library. The coming weeks. Nines did a lot of her reading about ham and social unrest and ocean-based natural disasters. She would work out as much as she could, inconspicuously. That included mostly push-ups and sit-ups. There was a treadmill in the break room, however, it had no power, which limited its functionality. Nines used the treadmill to get some of her jogging in, but that made her nervous because it was noisy. She noticed every other day that she could jog a little longer and do a few more push-ups. This meant Nines was going through more water, but it was worth it. She had dug into some of the martial arts magazines, and they talked about how being fit made you harder to kill. One of the magazines had someone bench pressing those weird blocks. To Nines, they looked like a pair of giant encyclopedias. Nines went and grabbed 2 of her largest encyclopedias and put the oversized books in sturdy bags with good handles, then used them for curls and presses. She could do more reps each day and even started adding books to the bags to make them weigh more. Eventually she would attach them to her legs and started doing the leg presses also. Nines wanted to be as hard to kill as possible. She even learned a few techniques developed with women's physiology in mind to fight back to their pistols so they could defend themselves and their loved ones. Some places call it gun kata and other places gun fu, but she only recognized it as one thing, America's first native martial art, and she liked it. While keeping in shape, Nines continued listening to her NOAA radio, but eventually it stopped giving information altogether. At some point during one of the days, the radio transmission simply ended. When that happened, Nines got out her ham radio and finished charging it up with the battery bank she had. The radio had options for both USB charging and a cigarette lighter and a 12-volt. Nines had pulled the numbers out of her bag, and they were frequencies, and as she found out through reading, some are repeaters, and she set up the offsets properly in tones after some trial and error. Some of the repeaters were down, but others seemed to be up. Nine soon found out everything that was going on through ham operators repeating over and over what they were hearing and seeing. Soon, Nines found the channel that all of her friends from the gun range were on. They'd been planning and strategizing which places were safe and which weren't. A few of the words didn't make sense. Nines realized this because they were using light code words but not talking in heavy code. Talking in heavy code would anger everyone else on their ham radios. What Nines was able to piece together was that the cities got overran with violent protesters. Instead of martial law being enacted, some form of government resistance came in and regained order in the cities miraculously. These groups being discussed moved in, then all of a sudden the violence and anarchy stopped. It was only speculation and a conspiracy theory, but the prevailing ideas was that the town liberators were actually in league and even shared resources with the chaos creators. Either way, it didn't matter now. What was important is there was enough intel to track the movements of the so-called resistance. It was ironic that the invading group called themselves the resistance when they seemed to solely exist to subvert the government. The rule of law, if you can call it that, was more along the lines of anarcho-communism. As everyone in Ham pointed out, that form of rule only led to totalitarianism. There were gun confiscations in the city. Everyone was being told you'd have to make city gardens. You had to renounce your citizenship to the country and do a new citizenship to the new country. The people who didn't do this were being executed or were fleeing. There was an influx of displaced citizens who were fleeing their cities to try to get away from this. If they had families, they were trying to find them, only to be met with roadblocks. Some of these roadblocks were from good guys and some were from bad guys. It was impossible to tell the difference, so there were scouts checking every roadblock from both sides trying to figure out which was which. There were some checkpoints that allowed guns and some that confiscated them all. Traveling by road to get out of the city essentially became impossible. Within a few days there was total lockdown and nobody else was getting out. That's when intel from the city stopped. Once intel from the city stopped, the next moves were already being plotted and planned. There were talks of how to get as much knowledge out as possible, and the other side had started raiding and ransacking libraries to clear them all of unvetted historical knowledge. It seemed to Nines that this other side wanted to rewrite history, and she would have none of it. One day during their planning stages, she was listening in and reading a book about non-conventional warfare, and her library came up in discussion. We do have a library near here, after all. Chatter is pointing in that direction within the next few days. Nines thought quickly as scenarios rushed through her mind. Could they be playing me? Do they know I'm listening? How would they find out? If I'm not broadcasting, they can't exactly triangulate my position. I haven't been talking. I don't think this is a trick. The guy on the radio talked for a few more minutes. Nines was sure she recognized their voices. She blanked out of her thoughts in fear and rejection and held the push to talk for a few seconds. Guys? A lump formed in her throat. I'm at the library. There was silence and tears welled up in her eyes. Had she just doomed herself? After a brief pause, they said a weird and random phrase to her. She raised an eyebrow and thought for a second. What a random phrase. She remembered reading in her books about long distance and short distance identity checks. She looked up at her piece of paper that they'd given her. She kept it taped to her radio. It had a couple of random phrases on it that she hadn't understood at the time, but now they made sense. Nines pushed the talk radio and repeated her phrase into the radio, tears welling up more and a lump in her throat swelling. There was a long pause. Nines said, finally, "Did you copy? Over?" "Hang on a minute, over." She imagined them talking amongst themselves, trying to figure out if she was legit or not, trying to figure out if she was worth the risk or not. Then there was a break in the static again. "We'll be in touch, out." Nines was in grief at this point and didn't know what to do. It was getting dark. It always helped her organize. She knew she would be able to see people from a long way away at night if they were using flashlights. It was dusk. Nines decided to go out in the library with the lowest power light she had and started creating sections of books that would absolutely be needed in a post-collapse event. Everything Nines had seen so far pointed this to being a partial collapse with ongoing civil unrest for the unforeseeable future, possibly 3 years at a minimum based on her research, provided nothing else happened. She knew nobody was messing with her because it would be impossible for that much chatter on that many stations to keep a hoax going for that long. Plus, she'd been in the library for days and nobody had stopped by except for the occasional book turn-in and lamentation of the library being closed.